Thank you. So let's get started. I'd like to welcome our first panel to the stage. As I said before, the FAA has racked up a list of accomplishments on unmanned aircraft that wouldn't have been possible without our partnerships with industry. But they also required close collaboration inside the FAA between our offices and across our lines of business. And so today, I'm joined by some of our senior executives who will share how we're coordinating our drone integration efforts across the agency. And so please help me welcome Peggy Gilligan, our Associate Administrator for Aviation Safety, Terry Bristol, Chief Operating Officer of the Air Traffic Organization, Winsome Lenfert, Deputy Associate Administrator for the Office of Airports, and Jim Eck, our Assistant Administrator for NextGen. And so, as you heard, oh, this chair, you really sink right in here.
We all did the same thing.
You know, the purpose of this panel is it really underscores what the Secretary and what Brian had to say in their introductory comments. I think we all know that unmanned aircraft are here to stay, and it is our job to make sure that they stay safely, and that's where this panel comes in. I'd like to ask each of them to just take a minute and introduce yourself, not just name and title, but a one-sentence summary of where you are in the organization and what your organization is responsible for. Peggy.
Thank you, Michael. I'm Peggy Gilligan. I am, until Friday, the Associate Administrator for Aviation Safety. I will retire effective March 31st, but it's a position I've held since January of 2009. And we're responsible for setting the standards for every person, product, an organization that operates in the national airspace. And you'll be hearing shortly how we've started to take on that responsibility as it relates to the unmanned community.
Hi, everyone. My name is Terry Bristol, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the FAA's Air Traffic Organization. We are the ANSP, Air Navigation Service Provider of the United States, and we do that safely and efficiently.
And Winsome Lenfert with the Office of Airports, and I'm one of the newbies up here. And the Office of Airports is responsible for airport development and safety of operations, and our role is integrating drones into the airport environment.
Good afternoon, I'm Jim Eck. I'm the Assistant Administrator for NextGen. And in addition to defining and defending what NextGen is intending to do and how we're doing it, we're also doing the research on all the safety implications of things like drones coming into the national airspace system. So we have the front end of everything in the agency as far as articulating it and laying the roadwork for how we get there.
Okay, well, thank you all. You know, let's start with what the cultures and perspectives are of the industries that we're talking about here. I think it's fair to say that what is sometimes called the traditional aviation industry has its own culture, and that unmanned aircraft has a culture that is quite different from that. The traditional aviation culture is it's a safety culture, which translates to a very cautious culture. Nobody wants to be the one that messes up what has been an incredible safety record. The UAS community comes to us with a culture that is predicated much more on innovation, on getting products to market as quickly as possible. And they want the market to serve the sorting function of making a product better. Now, obviously, I don't think we can expect that one side is going to change the culture of the other. But it is important that they coexist and work together. And so I'd like to, Peggy, turn to you. In terms of complexity, these cultural differences, how big a challenge was that from an aviation safety standpoint?
Thanks, Michael. When I think back 10, 12, 15 years, when we were starting to talk about the idea that unmanned systems would be integrating into the national airspace system, Our perspective was, well, we've introduced new technology into this community, into the aviation community since aviation began. We know how to do it and we're really good at it. All they need to do, all the new applicant needs to do, is to read the book, read the rules, come in and talk to us about how they're going to be able to show compliance to our rules. Do that, demonstrate compliance, we'll be glad to issue them a certificate, and they'll be welcomed in with open arms. It seemed it should be that easy for us because that's traditionally how it had been. Only then drones started arriving en masse, which was not something we had anticipated. And as you've just described, we also realized it was bringing into aviation a community that was not aviators, which is not a community that we were very familiar with. And so the first challenge for us was, who are these folks and how do we get to them? How do we touch them? How do we understand what it is they want to do in this system? And equally importantly, how do we share with them what their responsibilities are if they really do want to enter the aviation community? And so that was the challenge, and that's why things like registration were undertaken, because now we had a way of getting in touch with folks who wanted to come in and be a part of this system. And we had a way of sharing information, and we had a way of learning from them. What were their needs and requirements, and how could we build around that? How could we include that into our system? It's why we did Part 107, to set a framework so that these new entrants, you new entrants, could come in a way that we knew how to interact with you and be able to make you successful, but also maintain the same level of safety. So I've made it sound really easy, but it did take us the better part of these last 10 years, first of all, to really start to understand how different the two communities are, and to get us all around these tables so that we can really start communicating with one another, so that we can assure, as Michael's pointed out, that the level of safety stays the same or gets better, while we allow for the innovation that you can bring to this community.
Terry, you run a 24/7 operation, 365 days a year, or I guess 366 in a leap year. But so now you have this new player that is in the system. Talk a little bit about how we integrate that into existing airspace operations.
Right. I mean, I think people get it that it's a big airspace. We move a lot of traffic. On an average day, we manage about 50,000 operations, which is about 2 million passengers. In the U.S., my folks are responsible for about 31 million square miles of airspace, and that's not only over land, but large swaths of airspace in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So it's a complex system, but it's a safe system. And so I think our challenge and opportunity, and I think we're heavily engaged and leveraged in this UAS space, is advancing and getting this new entrant more and more into this airspace. But clearly, it's a busy place, and a lot of people just base it on what they can see. There's a lot of operations day to day, and so our focus is to ensure that anything we integrate is going to be done safely.
Now, Winsome, you characterized yourself as being the new kid on the block, but that has not stopped airport directors from having your telephone number, and you have been talking to a lot of them. How have they affected airports and the airports organization within the FAA?
You know, we're a small but mighty organization. We have thousands of airports. Matter of fact, we have over 3,000 airports in the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems, or public use airports. And, you know, UASs are very significant. You know, they provide a challenge, but they also provide an opportunity for airport operators. As a matter of fact, a lot of our airports are integrating them themselves. They're using them for inspections of both safety and operation. They're also using them for survey. But in the Office of Airports, we're really looking at how do we integrate these. Everything from airport access to how they integrate signs, markings, and standards on an airport. And you know, but we've been very fortunate that a lot of our airport sponsors are very excited about this new technology, and they've been embracing it, and they've been working with us on all of the issues, especially working on the communication with their local communities and the law enforcement. And so, you know, we're very excited about the new technology and all the wonderful opportunities it can provide for the airports.
Mm-hmm. Jim, you have been spending a lot of time figuring out how we incorporate new technology into the national airspace system. You started thinking about the technology that the FAA itself uses, but now, in a very short time, we're incorporating new users into that. Talk a little bit about how we work with industry through the Drone Advisory Committee.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. So the Drone Advisory Committee, much like its counterpart in the manned aviation arena, the Next Gen Advisory Committee, plays a linchpin capability between the FAA, the industry itself, and the communities throughout the country. There's a couple of words that come to my mind when I think about the things that we're trying to do there. Balance, consensus, learning, and ultimately collaboration. And if you look at the kinds of things we've asked the Drone Advisory Committee to take on, everything from how do we fund the system? How do we figure out how to take care of all the activities we've got going on and have a budget that makes sense relative to it and relative to the people who are going to pay into it? That's a big balancing act between manned aviation and unmanned aviation. There's a lot of constituents involved and a lot of stakeholders who are concerned. When we look at balancing the needs of or the interest of state and local jurisdictions and their concerns about how drones will fly in airspace and balancing that with the FAA's need to manage safely and efficiently everything that's moving through the airspace. Again, a pretty big ticket item as far as working with the community to figure those kinds of things out. And then third, trying to figure out how does everybody actually operate with the FAA in the airspace itself while they're flying there. Taking into account the word that you talked about earlier, integration. How do you integrate safely all these drones into a system that has to be managed by people ultimately? What technologies have to be available? And if we're not just cordoning them off and putting them in their own little airspace, ultimately they have to fly through airspace or with aircraft in airspace together. And so there's a lot of technologies that have to be brought to bear. But the big problems that the Drone Advisory Committee really has to focus on is how do we work together? How do we get solutions that work for everybody?
Sure. And again, you can be texting in questions while our discussion is ongoing. The moderators have just asked that I remind everyone that you try to keep your question to 160 characters or less, not 160 words or less. So, and we will try to work those into into our conversation. In fact, we have one that's popped in right now. The question is, could the panel set expectations for us regarding how quickly the FAA would be able to move on recommendations that might be coming from the Drone Advisory Committee this year? And so, Peggy, I'll ask you to start with that one.
Sure. Obviously, it depends on what the recommendations are. Some things we think will be relatively easy for both the FAA and the community to take action on. Because part of what we ask from the advisory committees is not simply to tell FAA what FAA should do and how FAA ought to spend its resources. That's easy. What we really need to figure out is what can we and you as a community do together so as to continue to allow for enhanced operation and maintaining the same level of safety. So again, some of it will be things that become relatively obvious. If you do these things, FAA can do those things. They oftentimes fit within our current policies or procedures. We may need to do some internal adjustments. So those can be implemented relatively easily. Anything that will require rulemaking does require a very well-established process of notice, comment, and final rulemaking that takes a period of time, usually between 2 to 3 years, depending on complexity. So all of that will remain to be seen, and a lot of that will be what the advisory committee will really end up discussing. Once you see, we could do 50 things, but what are the 3 or 5? What are the real things that if we as a community do them will make a real difference in a timely way? And so that will be a part of that conversation.
And I think the important thing is that Peggy touched on, and I just really want to emphasize that is not everything needs to be accomplished through a rulemaking process. Right. This is an industry that aviation generally does a lot through voluntary standards or consensus standards that are developed that the industry voluntarily subscribes to. And so there are many tools that are available to us. The important thing is bringing everyone to the table to figure out what a way forward might look like. Winsome, I wanted to talk with you about the airport's concerns about security, about unmanned aircraft being where they shouldn't be. And what's your take on this? What do you think we collectively across the industry need to be doing?
It's actually a balance that you have to find between expanding and embracing this technology, but understanding there's a real need for safety and security on an airport environment. A lot of it comes from education. It's very important as one of the most important parts of a flight, no matter what the size of the aircraft, is the final approach. And we have a lot of folks coming into the environment that are not really knowledgeable of the airport environment. And they are operating aircraft that are very flexible. They can move slowly, they can maneuver quickly, but our traditional aircraft actually are moving much quicker but less able to react. And so when you're bringing this new technology and awareness, it's important from everybody from a local family that are out there flying on their own for recreation and just happen to enter into an airport environment, to those that are less innocent. They really have to know and anticipate how to operate on this airport environment, or if they just happen to be in there, how to react to it. And so really what it comes down to is education, awareness, and communication. Communicating to your local community on where and how to operate, and also seeing and aware and avoid. It's really important the airport sponsors establish this relationship with their local communities as well as their local law enforcement offices, so that if there is a problem that happens, everybody is ready and on board and knows how to react. And this is especially important. A lot of our airports have a military presence and that are actually operating the drones. And so it's really, again, back to that awareness, that communication, and that education on what to expect and see and avoid, and awareness on an airport environment.
Okay, we've gotten a couple of questions in, and so I wanted to pivot to a conversation of, a short conversation about UTM. Certainly UAS traffic management is critical to integration. Terry, I'd like you to talk a little bit about LANCE as a first step toward a more robust concept of UAS traffic management. What can you tell us about that?
Well, first of all, we have to have an acronym for everything, so that is the acronym. But what LANCE is Low Altitude Authorization Notification Capability. And it's, let me back up for a minute. So we handle, Peggy's team does as well, authorizations and waivers. And it's a manual process. And pre-UAS, it was a manageable process. But as Peggy had indicated, the appetite and the desire to operate UASs just really took on a life of its own. And so it's not unusual to have thousands of authorizations and waiting to be processed. Again, it is a manual process. So what we've done is, we had a need, and industry had a desire, so we've partnered, and the agency we've developed maps for all of our airports with the important information that needs to be on them. And then industry, at no cost to the agency, will actually manage through that. And so if you want to operate your UAS in a controlled airspace near or close to an airport, as long as you're below the required altitudes, it could be a very rapid authorization, and it could almost even be immediate. And we expect to have this capability online before the end of this year. We're going as quickly as we can, but this is a really, really good thing. Our waivers will still be handled manually. We don't have as many of those. We'll see where that goes in the future, but those are for exceptions. That's where somebody is asking to do something that's not within the automatic approvals. They might want to operate at night. It might be beyond visual line of sight. There's something else about it that requires a closer look in evaluation. So again, I think industry had a way to do this in a very timely manner. And quite honestly, I think that the way technology is changing, it's evolving so quickly. So this is really kind of an I think, industry sweet spot.
Now, there's a related question asking about NASA's role in integration into the NAS. And so, Jim, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about NASA's involvement in UTM.
Mm-hmm. Sure. As we talked, and I do want to note that LANCE actually is not an acronym that spells Lance, but it's another favorite we have. So if we're trying to do a crawl, walk, run scenario here, Terry defined kind of the LANCE system in terms of its ability to take in the information about what everybody wants to do in uncontrolled airspace today, but trying to move quickly beyond the low volume, low impact operation, moving to a higher volume and maybe still lower impact operations where we can automate all the notifications that are required and authorizations required. We're quickly going to find ourselves moving to a scenario where people want to move out of controlled airspace and start moving through controlled airspace of all types. And so NASA and the FAA have been working together on a research transition team construct, something that we've used successfully for a number of years in a number of different venues to take emerging technologies, figure out how they best operate for the needs that we have within the FAA, and then bring those things through a quick evolution process of research and development and into operation. Now, not that the FAA intends to necessarily buy or implement a UTM, because we're still looking at the potential that UTMs are going to exist out in the community itself. Maybe that brings me to a point that Peggy brought up, that the question that Peggy was asked was, how do we accelerate things, or how do we see things getting done sooner? And I think that one of the answers to that is a characteristic of those capabilities is the more the industry can do as part of the development of the operational capability in the service, the more that the FAA can rely on some third party to be actually capable of producing that service and running that service, the faster we can integrate things. So within the UTM world, we're looking to that device and that capability as the place where we start moving from just notifications to coordination and reporting. So we have a place where everybody can start putting in what I want to do, how I want to do it, where I want to go, and then air traffic can take a look at that and authorize it quickly and have situational awareness around major metropolitan areas and around operations over people and beyond line of sight operations, as well as interdicting major airports. And so that's going to be a critical linchpin technology for us. It's also a place where we're going to be able to learn quite a bit very quickly. And that's where I think, again, a pivot back to the Drone Advisory Committee is going to be important. We're going to be able to get this technology in place, take a look at it, look at our test centers across the country, bring people there, see what works, see what doesn't work, tailor it quickly to what we really need. So FAA and NASA have been moving pretty rapidly as far as the development of the UTM capability, and we're looking forward to sharing a lot of results with everybody in this room and everyone who is concerned about getting drones up and operating more quickly.
We have a couple of questions following up on Terry's comments about LANCE, and so first is just a clarification. LANCE will cover all 20,000 airports in the NAS. That's what Terry implied.
I don't think it's 20,000 maps that we're producing. So I know that over the course of the next 3 days, we're going to have deep and in breakout sessions, and I know my folks are in there as well. So there'll be much more detail shared about that.
And one follow-up is, will the LANCE airport maps be available to 107 operators?
Yes.
So you talked about airports, but we have a question about drone ports. do we envision a day where there will be drone ports that are geared to commercial operations of drone services?
You know, it's not out of the realm of possibilities. I mean, we actually have had a proposal for a drone port in Boulder City, Nevada. And we're looking at a lot of different things. What are the standards that go with it? How do you look at the operations? Signing and lighting and marking don't work traditionally that we have today, don't necessarily work for the drones. The types of cameras they use, the operations they use, the signs and standards and markings aren't appropriate. So we've got a lot of research to do. And it even comes down to how do you identify these on aeronautical charts? And or do they have our own separate charting process? So there's a lot of things. We're actually starting a lot of research on that now, trying to figure out how to integrate these into our system.
Now, it didn't take long to get into the preemption topic. I have about 5 questions here relating. So I'm going to try to throw this to the group kind of in what I hope is a logical order. The first question relates to what is the authority of a private property owner? And specifically, by what authority can they prohibit drone launching from their property or operations in the airspace over them? Anyone want to take a crack at that?
You probably know more about this than anybody.
You're a good lawyer for that.
I like Peggy's really good at delegating up. Clearly a property owner has the right to make a determination of what happens on their property. But the question of what happens over their property runs into a time-honored right that a property owner has for quiet enjoyment of their property. And we always think about it as a property owner has a right. If there is a tree on an adjacent piece of property and it overhangs your house, you have a right to remove those branches of that tree, even though the tree may not be on your property. The fact that it's overhanging your house and potentially presenting a hazard, yes, that is something that you can do something about. And so this is something that we're asking the DAC to start to give some thought to, of how do we reconcile these individual responsibilities that we might have as property owners versus the larger air commerce authorities that the FAA has. Which brings us to another question that has come in, which is about roles of city governments and authorities that cities might have in this particular area. So,
well, I mean, again, I think this whole area is one that we've asked the DAC to advise on because there is a bit of not a clash so much of an integration or an intersection, I guess, of roles and responsibilities. So clearly, local communities have zoning authorities, they have criminal law authorities, the FAA and the US government's control of airspace is a piece of all of that. And it's complicated. And so we thought the best way to go was to make sure, again, that the community's having these conversations and really looking at what are those conflicts and what is the right set of roles and responsibilities. And help us to define that as well.
Now, Winsome, can you talk about how we reconcile in an airport world what a city's zoning responsibilities are versus the FAA's authority, as the operator of the system?
It's actually, a lot of our airports are actually owned by government entities. So it's a close connection. What complicates it is sometimes those jurisdictional boundaries aren't as clean as we'd like. Mm-hmm. It's multiple cities, counties, and sometimes even states get involved in ownership of airports. And so really what it's important is like I said earlier, is that communication. And so it's sitting down, talking with the government individuals, the city council, the governor's office, your local law enforcement, and talking about the issues and the conflicts before they happen. And so that everybody's on the same page. it's unlike a lot of things that airports already work through. You know, they work with their local neighboring communities on noise and outreach and things like that that cross jurisdictional boundaries. And so it's really just getting on the same page early in the process before it becomes a situation. So.
And I think it's also important to point out that it is a local jurisdiction that decides where to put the airport. But once that decision is made, they agree to be bound by a series of grant assurances that if they're going to operate an airport, it has to meet a defined set of federal standards and federal responsibilities that are embodied within the grants that they receive from the FAA there. Now, the question is asked, also staying with this roles of government, how do we see the roles of city governments both in advising the FAA on how we integrate this technology, but also in the rulemaking process? How can local agencies get involved? Anyone?
Well, again, the DAC has representation from the Council of Mayors. For that very reason, to make sure that city kind of local perspectives are brought there. Rulemaking is a public process, and of course anyone can file comments, and it's not uncommon, especially for airport-related kinds of rules, or if we do operational rules, for local governments, local organizations to comment on what they think the impact of that regulation may be, and to make recommendations for improvements or changes that can be made. So again, we're always looking for that public opportunity, I think as Winsome referred to it, you know, to make sure there's that outreach and the opportunity for input. We also often do what we call advisory rulemaking committees to help us set the framework for a rule, and if it's appropriate, we invite local or state community representatives to be a part of that. So it's not for lack of opportunity to have your input, but all inputs are not necessarily going to be influential in the final outcome, and that's, I think, why the more we can work together and find the right compromises, the more successful we can be.
Mm-hmm. Jim, can you talk a little bit about that, the process we follow, you know, when we're trying to come up with consensus positions?
So a lot of the things that when we're looking at the Next Gen Advisory Committee, generally the FAA will try to set the framework, as Peggy said. We'll try to bound the decision making that we're looking for, just because having a blank piece of paper and 1,000 people writing on it, and generally we won't get very far. So we really need to have some framing of the problem. In this case, when we talk about some of the issues we were talking about, we asked the advisory committee and the subcommittee itself to take a look at, you know, what are the legitimate needs of communities versus states versus other municipalities versus the FAA's need for safety and efficiency, and certainly the collective desires of the industry represented here to have the ability to conduct a business that makes sense, that has an operation that's efficient and can be produced in a cost-effective way. And so we try to make sure that everybody in the room starts out with the same understanding of the problem and bounding it. An example from, I guess, moving from that particular problem to our operations team, our task group 2, we also asked them to take a look at, in the same notion of framing a problem, we took all the low altitude airspace operations that we had seen over the last number of years, and they number in the hundreds, and depending on how you want to really count, variations could be in the thousands of different business ideas. And we tried to aggregate them into a dozen or more major operational concepts and scenarios and concepts of use, and brought them back to the subcommittee and said, hey, take a look at these problem spaces. We've tried to frame it in terms of the characteristics of the operation itself and types of operations that could operate within this swim lane, and can you see your business ideas within those swim lanes? And in this particular case, the driving concern of the FAA is there's no way for air traffic controllers and for the airspace to design to accommodate maybe thousands of different business ideas, but we might be able to find a dozen or more different operational vignettes in which those businesses could operate within. And then we can ask the community to innovate within those swim lanes. And so what we really try to do in the consensus business is drive everybody to a knowledge base that's common, and then drive through a framework that makes sense so that we can get the collective group of innovation going.
So here is a good question, and that is, it starts with aviation has a well-developed concept of what constitutes an acceptable risk. Is there an acceptable level of risk for unmanned as opposed to manned aviation? If so, what is it? If not, and how do we set one?
Well, excuse me, I think you can see in Part 107, for example, where we are looking at how we can identify what the hazards are that are maybe a part of UAS operation, and how we can look to mitigate that. So I don't think it's not as though FAA defines sort of, the number for safety, or safety is a continuum, and we accept a certain level of risk. For example, even in manned aviation, we accept a certain level of risk in a general aviation recreational setting, where you as an individual choose to be a pilot and to operate in the system. We allow you to accept a different level of risk than we permit in the commercial operation of large transport aircraft carrying paying passengers from Washington National to Chicago. And I think we'll see the same with UAS. That, again, we already do. Recreational use is defined in a certain way. We're beginning to define commercial uses in a slightly different way. And we'll continue, again, with the community's input, to evaluate what are those risks and what's an acceptable level of risk. As we look to operations over people, we'll be looking at what are the risks that we are willing, or that the uninvolved individual is willing to accept in terms of potential injury or potential fatality. And all of those will be what informs the continued, initially, approval of waivers and exceptions, and ultimately what the general rulemaking process will be.
Michael, also I think about the work that we're doing inside the agency with the Pathfinder projects. And when we think about BNSF Railroad, and initially we didn't do the beyond visual line of sight operations, but the more we worked with BNSF, and they came in and explained what their operation would be, and we've been able to expand the authorization for what the actual work is that they're doing around even beyond visual line of sight. So I think that we did, the developments as we go, and we can learn more. It allows us to just continue to evolve and to expand what we actually can authorize.
Okay. Winston, Jim?
I would say that I'm not sure that the acceptable level of risk actually changes that much for the actual operation of the unit itself. As Peggy said, if you're flying in airspace where there's not, a lot of other aircraft around, you're following a lot of the kind of rules we have today for manned aircraft in that same airspace, and we've got technologies that we're going to more or less require in those relative to detect and avoid circumstances. One of the different things that maybe some of the operations bring is the ability to reduce other risks. So we can now use a UAS to take a look at rail beds or bridges or some other aspect of the infrastructure that we might not have otherwise been able to take a look at and detect. And so they bring about the ability to reduce risk in other ways. And so, but I don't think that they're actually, even when I think about those operations, changing the risk posture itself that we would expect for an airborne platform, if you will.
There's a fair amount of interest in the remote ID ARC that I mentioned in my setup comments, and the question is, how does one apply? And I think we have a slide we can put up.
Slides?
Yeah.
Can we see it?
Eric? Good. Up? Okay.
We can't.
So take a look.
Oh, just a
Okay. Question here about how does industry engage, and what process does the FAA use as we select industry participants for UAS teams, such as the Advisory Committee, such as the UAS Safety Team, or the many subcommittees and task forces that are dealing with us? Could we talk a little bit about that?
We probably set up most of those, so let me start, but I know, all of you are involved in some of those committees as well. But generally, what we try to do is get as balanced a representation as we can. The unmanned community is adding, obviously, a little bit more complexity to that because you are a very diverse community, as is the manned community, and so we don't just want to double the number of participants we have on these committees because building toward consensus is hard, and it needs to be sort of a manageable size group. But that is why we don't require that people on some of the subcommittees, for example, need to be from the organizations that are on the full committee. We try to get as diverse a set of participants at all those different levels, just so we're not missing something. And again, especially for this community where we are less versed in both what you're currently doing and probably not very well aware of where you see yourselves moving because it is moving so quickly. So it is really an effort to try to look at balance to make sure we have the opinions of as many sort of elements of all the communities represented as we can. And we're always looking at, as people leave, do we need to change membership to add new perspectives or to maintain a certain balance? So it's a bit of an art more than a science, but I think so far we've been pretty successful.
Jim?
Yeah, I guess I would add to that too, that we're looking for a certain level of individual, both in the corporation, the industry at large, academia, people that can not only, because we're looking for consensus, we're looking for you to represent not only your corporation, but maybe a whole segment of a population. And so we're looking for individuals within corporations who can, carry the day in terms of what we're likely going to be difficult subjects, things that you're going to have to agree to. And it would be great to have some standing in the community as well as a person of integrity, because to have consensus means the people that are there speaking on behalf of others are trying their level best to represent others. And so when you walk out of that room, there's usually a responsibility to communicate with others. It takes a lot of work to get to consensus. And with a community this large and this new, getting to know a lot of people and getting the word out as to why something had to be done the way it was done is a crucial factor here. And so we're always looking for individuals who can carry that kind of responsibility.
Sure. Terry?
I would add that inside of the agency, all of us sitting up here, as well as some of the other parts of the FAA, like legal, security and hazardous materials, our folks, we all have people that sit not only at the DAC level, but also in the subcommittee levels as well. And that works across the Next Gen Advisory Committee as well. So this is a huge commitment on our part to make this successful, because it takes so many different diverse stakeholders working together, and we consider ourselves diverse inside of the FAA as well.
If I could just add, I want to highlight something Jim said, because it's so important, and we've learned this in some respects in the hard way. We do a number of advisory committees, and oftentimes on the manned side, we have a very technical community that gets together and decides this would be the best way to solve things. And so then we propose it in a notice of proposed rulemaking, and we get negative comments from everyone in the industry. I'd say, but wait, you were on the committee. And the difference between the technical folks and those who have to make the business decision of whether or not their company or their industry will do something can be terribly dramatic. The correct technical outcome may not be doable for any number of reasons by the folks who have to do it. And so the whole point of reaching that consensus is to make sure that it is implementable. And so that the membership need to be those people who not only can bring the technical expertise to figure out what the solution is, but have the wherewithal within their community to bring that community to consensus around how exactly we're going to be able to do it. Because proposed regulations that have no consensus will never be finalized.
Vincent?
I just got to echo, it's the diversity of the community. And from the airport's perspective, we have representatives on the Drone Advisory Committee, but they not only represent their airport, but they a whole nother level, everything from private use airports, general aviation, all the way up to commercial service. And it's such a diverse group, and it's just one element of reflecting the diversity that is on the overall DAC. And so it's so important, again, that communication. I hear it over and over again. Well, why don't I get representation? Well, you have representation. It's up to that representation to communicate and to work with their particular industry or their particular segment of the industry. And so I just have to echo both of those. That's so important to have that two-way communication and that messaging.
You know, there's a question here about the current administration regulatory restrictions and what impact, if any, those would have on the good work that we have been doing on UAS integration. And the question is, do we expect that progress will be impeded as a result of the Trump administration's regulatory restrictions and the 2-for-1?
Well, this is not my first transition, and this is not, and quite honestly, what we're seeing in the rulemaking front, at least, is not very uncommon. My experience has been that all new administrations put a hold on anything that was sort of in the works that might be quickly going to a final stage, because they want to make sure that the program for which they've just been elected is actually going to be able to be properly implemented, which actually seems perfectly fair from our perspective. As to the 2-for-1 and all of that kind of guidance, we're still refining all of that. I don't think that we have a clear picture yet on exactly how that's going to be implemented. But we have had conversations both within the Department of Transportation and through them with people at the Office of Management and Budget, that there are different kinds of rules. And it would be helpful, we think, to look at them somewhat differently. So when it comes to UAS, we define these as enabling rules. As I said at the very beginning, if y'all could come in and meet the standards I have right now, you could have gotten in anyway. If you can show that your vehicle meets our design standards and that your operations and training and pilot preparation meet our current standards, you can operate in the NAS right now. But the reality is many of you can't meet those standards, and so in order to enable your operations, we have to make changes to our rules. I think that kind of an approach is getting a very positive audience right now as this administration starts to really understand there are lots of different kinds of rules and that perhaps they need to be able to refine some of those definitions somewhat.
Yeah, and I think Peggy made a really important point. You know, many of you have made the point that a lot of these rulemaking activities are enabling in nature, and the administration is extremely supportive of anything that needs to be done to enable new industries and new technologies to be proliferated in the marketplace. One question, you know, is more of a global question. You know, there's an awful lot going on here in the United States. There's an awful lot going on in other parts of the world. Where does the United States stand relative to the rest of the world in terms of the maturity of our regulations? And what about international harmonization of those rules in the years ahead?
So we are leading right now in terms of having the most refined framework. 107 is probably the most extensive set of rulemakings anywhere in the world. And we're also leading the international efforts to continue to make sure that what happens around the world is harmonized. So we are the vice chair for the Joint Authorities Rulemaking on Unmanned Systems, or JARIS, which is something I'm sure many of you are also involved in. It's right now there's membership of around 50 nation states that are looking at what is it they want to do themselves, but how can we also assure that it's common around the world. We are also the vice chair for the committee up at the International Civil Aviation Organization. So the U.S. leadership in these international efforts, I think, is not only important, but I think we're playing that role very well at this point. And it's important that we harmonize these standards around the world for all of you to have effective business models that you can move not just from state to state here in the U.S., but you'll be able to operate in Europe across state lines or wherever it may be. It is maturing. There are many states that have nothing in place yet. There are some that have things that are somewhat at odds with either things we've done or things other states have done. But we see that maturing actually very quickly, and I think you'll see a well-harmonized set of standards over the next few years.
Terry, you just returned a few weeks ago from CANSO, which is the International Organization of Air Navigation Service Providers. Where were unmanned aircraft on the agenda at that conference, and what are you hearing from your international colleagues?
Well, it took a center stage at CANSO, and it has for a number of international events. I would agree with Peggy. I think right now the United States is leading in the development around just the rules and how we're progressing with the UAS integration. You know, we play a big part in the United States in CANSO, and CANSO is made up of probably around 87 different countries, air navigation service provider, those provisions, and as well as many industry partners as well, and are very active in not only just UAS, but also putting together UAS materials that can be used as development and training for other developing ANSPs, just basic parts of UAS operations. You know, I think what's also important is when we talk about UTM, and Jim talked about the work we're doing with NASA, the rest of the world is actually not only watching very closely to see what NASA is doing and developing, but also directly communicate with NASA. I was in Germany last fall and actually sat on a UAS, it was a symposium for a day at DFS, and actually one of the breakout sessions, they remoted in PK from NASA, and he did this little mini workshop around UAS and this notion of UTM. And I think the good news here is that I think we're pretty much aligned from a world standpoint on just seeing how NASA develops this UTM concept, and really a lot more work has to be done around this, but just this notion of, you know, registering, other countries around the world are picking that up. They're also looking to see what we do as we branch out into just UTM proper, because we've said that we will crawl, you know, before we run. And so everybody is kind of watching each other. I don't think anybody is ahead of us right now, but they also see what we've done by standing up a drone advisory committee. And so I think these countries are really looking to leverage the work that we're doing in the US, but also that each other are doing. And I think that's good.
Yeah, Jim?
I'll just say that the international harmonization piece is usually pretty crucial to those trying to sell products around the world. Yeah. And so when we agree on standards on how things like electronic fencing or other aspects of how an operation would actually work, the more that it's standardized, the better the product and the easier the product is to design and develop. And I know in the manned community, it becomes a very big deal when you're trying to build large platforms, and you really don't want procedures operating differently around the world. And certainly there's a lot of human component to that, but there's a technological piece around the command and control systems, the detect and avoid systems, all the other components of the vehicle that looking for an internationally harmonized solution is usually something that ICAO is after in a big way. And I don't know if you're going to win some. Okay.
Well, I was going to. Well, just are you picking up the same thing from the International Airports Organizations?
Yeah, same type of thing. It's that integration, that rules, that there's a lot of, again, opportunities for them to be used on the airport environment, from safety inspection, security, those types of things, but it's trying to integrate them safely and efficiently.
And one, a question here related to these international efforts. Do you have an opinion on EASA's prototype regulation toward risk-based certifications of missions rather than unmanned aircraft?
We actually see the approach that we're taking very well aligned with what EASA has talked about. First of all, the European Aviation Safety Agency does not currently have authority or what they call competence in the area of small unmanned systems. That is something they have requested from the European Commission. It's under consideration at this point. So the proposal that they put out is really guidelines to their many state members in an effort to begin this whole concept of harmonizing, to make sure at least the European states are taking kind of a common approach. Although, as you know, several of the states have some things in place that are somewhat inconsistent with the European approach. So I do think at the end of the day, our operating frameworks will be harmonized. There will be probably slight differences in the way we describe it and the way they describe it. But assuming that they get competence in this area by the end of this year, which is what they're anticipating, we'll work closely with them then as they officially put forward their proposal and have that go through their approval process through the European Commission.
You know, there is, what we're talking about is, you know, a lot of how we integrate new technology into the airspace. There's also a related technological evolution that's taking place in terms of how the airspace itself operates. In the US, it's our Next Gen program. In Europe, it's CESAR. And Jim, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this intersection between the new entrants and the technological innovation of how we operate the airspace itself.
So in planning for Next Gen, we've put together a host of different technologies that I think are going to come to bear, you know, certainly in this arena as well. Our SWIM program for information exchange about the status of everything in the NAS and you know, what's inside of our automation system and what's going on. We're making that available to all airspace users, and I think that'll be a critical enabling technology, and especially when it's kind of paired with a UTM capability. Beyond that, ADS-B, while it's not something that we're going to put on the small UAS, the fact that manned aircraft will have that technology on board and a UAS can receive that and, you know, stay well clear, I think is going to be another critical technology. Things like datacom, while we won't probably need that in the small UAS realm as an air-to-ground link, I think the messaging and the framing of everything associated with how we do interaction between air traffic control and air vehicles, going over telecommunications networks between the controllers and the pilots in command, I think will be another key technology component. So I think there's a number of technologies that we're building in Next Gen that'll be able to be used and certainly help frame the UAS evolution process.
Can you talk about some of the work that's ongoing at the Tech Center?
So at the Tech Center, we've got a number of relationships going on. Not only are we doing a lot of the safety research on the vehicles themselves, but we're also working with our Center of Excellence, Assure, trying to work through a lot of the different human factors challenges for UAS operations, a lot of the new technologies, the detect and avoid technologies that we're working on. We've worked through all of the collision avoidance system capabilities, ACAS XU capabilities for unmanned aircraft in the future, both at the Tech Center and with our Assure partners. We're working certainly collaboratively with all of the Pathfinder programs as well. So there's quite a bit going on right now in the UAS world, trying to make sure that every phase of our future with UAS comes to fruition in a timely way. A lot of the things that are still left to be done, beyond the UTM work that's nearest and the Lance work that's going on, is integrating UAS operations into our automation systems that run air traffic management as a business. And so there's quite a bit of work left to be done there as well. So.
How are you feeling about continued FAA funding for the UTM program?
I think it's in pretty good shape. I don't see any.
But subject to an annual budget process that we go through every year.
All those caveats.
I have more concerns than Jim.
That's pretty optimistic.
What was that?
I just said that sounded pretty optimistic.
Yeah. Question about...
I was positive because most of it is NASA funding.
Oh, okay. Aircraft noise has become big news in recent years. Is the FAA concerned about or looking at drone noise?
I guess I can take that one. We've worked really a lot with the noise and with partnering with airport communities around airports, local communities. And we've had a lot of lessons learned over time with what it looks like with outreach with the local communities. We've done the airport sponsors themselves have done roundtables. Any type of our environmental reviews, we require a noise analysis and mitigation requirements. And so we look at if any new technology you integrate, this is just one of the pieces that go with it. And so again, it's that as I've talked about before, is that communication, that partnership with the local communities. And it's working together. And so a lot of that outreach is education. You get everything from when you talk about drone ports, what does that look like and how is it integrated into the local community? And what do those traffics look like? You look at how the airport sponsors using the drones on the airport and is it creating any concern for the local communities? And so all of that is just, it's education, it's outreach, it's getting folks to know what this technology is and what it can do for them as well, so.
Mm-hmm. Peggy?
If I could just add, I think beyond noise, what we've learned from the manned community is it is important that aviation is a good neighbor. So whatever that particular risk may be, for manned aircraft, it tends to be noise. That's what people notice about it. For your community, it may not be noise, but we do know that your operations are noticed when they're in local communities and that people are concerned about those things. And I would encourage you to learn the lessons that manned aircraft, it took a manned aircraft a long time to learn, in fact, that if you can, as Winsome just was discussing, if you can work with whatever that community is, and I think it's harder for you all to define the community that you may affect, but if you can figure out how to work with that community, educate them about what you bring to the community in terms of economic benefits or investments or whatever, you know, sort of the pro is for why they should want you in their community, it will help you in the long run. Because aviation, for whatever reason, people notice what is in the skies around them, and as much as they may like using the airspace, they don't like people using the airspace around their homes. So I would really encourage you to understand what those risks are that you face with local communities and try to figure out early on in your history how you're going to be a good neighbor.
Barry?
You know, in ATO, we have a lot of lessons learned around noise when it comes to manned aviation. We've worked closely with airports and our Office of Policy back at headquarters, and we've developed some best practices. I think that's probably work that will be leveraged through the DAC as well when we think about drones in the airspace. And I would have to imagine as time goes by that this will become there will be a lot more engagement around this discussion around noise with drones in and around communities, depending on the operations.
Jim?
So I'd say one of the things that, and related to the rulemaking discussion we had earlier, we talked about the DAC being a place for consensus, and I think that's critical. But the other thing that I think the manned community is learning, and I think would do well here coming out of the DAC, is the ability to speak with one voice. It's great for folks to go up and talk to their local representatives. It's great for everybody to petition for their favorite thing in the national airspace system, but it is 10 times more powerful, maybe a lot more powerful, when a lot of voices all agree on the same thing. And so whether it's rulemaking that you're looking for, or you're looking for a way to collaborate around, whether it's noise or some other component of UAS, a consensus viewpoint and a voice is probably the most significant thing, and that would probably be the most significant thing you could come out of a drone advisory committee with. The manned community spends a lot of time trying to figure out how to speak with one voice, and when they do, it's to great effect. When we have collaboration on a consensus, we move very quickly, and certainly there's a lot of power in doing that.
Sure. Here is a question. Could we talk a little bit more about some of the counter UAS technologies that we're currently studying and their potential for achieving safety? Winsome, do you want to take a crack?
So we're doing a lot of testing on the counter UAS technology, and it's everything from how it interacts with the current manned aircraft and all the technologies we have on the airport. And we've been doing a lot of testing. We did some testing at Atlantic City International. We've been out to Denver International Airport, and this spring we're actually testing at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. And it's looking at what types of technology are available out there, how they interact with other technologies we have on the airfield, and then it's also how do we use them. So it's one thing to detect, but then how do you look at mitigation once you detect? It's also looking at who's responsible for these different types of systems, whether it's the airport sponsor, the local communities, how are all these technologies integrated? And so it's really beginning. We've got a lot more research that we're working toward. I know a lot of airport sponsors are very excited about this technology in order to protect around the airport, and so more to come.
Peggy?
Well, I mean, we're part of the team as well that's out at the airports monitoring the testing and looking at, what the various integration of systems in order to detect could be and how to do this most effectively. It's a challenging issue. But again, I think, with the research work, we think we're on a path to trying to understand what does work, what doesn't work, what are all the pieces that one might need. Then we'll need to look at the questions of, okay, assuming we want that, who is it, who's responsible for buying it, who's responsible for maintaining it and operating it. So there's still a lot to learn.
And I'd add, what is the role of ATC? What kind of indications would we need on the displays that we're looking at as well? So still a lot of definition needs to be applied to this.
A question about remote ID. We talked about the ARC, and then Jim mentioned ADSB, and the question is, can you say a little bit more about that? Is that where we're headed?
I wouldn't think for the small unmanned aircraft itself, we really can't have a lot of radiators in that band at this point compared to the ones we already have. So it seems like ADSB would not necessarily be the technology of choice for broadcasting an ID or a position. There are a number of other technologies and other bands that I think could suffice for that. But the most significant might be, whether or not that vehicle needs to just respond only when it's asked. So as opposed to a continuous broadcast capability, if interrogated, it needs to come back with a response. So there's a couple of different technologies I think that are being considered in that realm. And I think that the role of ADSB will play more of a safety role for unmanned aircraft, staying clear of manned aircraft that are radiating ADSB.
There's a related question. Does this issue need to be resolved before we can talk about flights over people, or can the two proceed in parallel?
Well, I think they will proceed in parallel. I mean, as you've highlighted today, we will bring together the community to start having these conversations, put together an ARC to start understanding what the technology options might be. And as we see that developing, it will help, in fact, inform the rulemaking around operations over people and operations beyond line of sight. So they are all related, but we know we can't wait for one before we do the other, so we're going to have to keep them moving on sort of parallel paths.
Sure. We have a lot of questions about enforcement, and first the framing question: is there an enforcement policy for those who violate Part 107?
There's a compliance philosophy for anyone who operates in the national airspace, and it's an important distinction. What we have found is there's a role for enforcement, obviously, for intentional bad actors, but by and large, the folks who operate in the national airspace system are voluntary compliers. Now, as a new community, you do need to demonstrate that that's your intention, that you mean to be in compliance. But we go into it with that assumption, that if you've gone to the trouble of getting your vehicle, in this case, or an airplane, getting properly certificated, understanding what waivers and other approvals you might need, that you mean to do this correctly. And if there is some time when you're in non-compliance, then our approach will be to understand why that happened and make sure we and you can make sure it doesn't happen again, bring you back into compliance and get to the root cause of what caused it. So that is the approach that we've taken through now, as our inspectors, become aware of an operator, whether it's because someone who holds a 333 exemption for a commercial operation or now under Part 107, or even recreational users. If our inspectors have reason to interact with someone, they start with the assumption that you did it by mistake, and with education, they and you can figure out how to do it right, and you can get back into compliance. So that's the approach.
Jim?
I would say that one of the things that it's not a detection problem or a compliance device, but things like Lance and UTM, once they move into the community and get adopted and start to get used, we'll get to the point where the 99.99% of all vehicles flying are supposed to be where they're supposed to be, and if they're not, it's by accident, or explicitly that somebody's doing something out of the norm. So the sooner I think we can get to these automation systems where everybody is filing where they want to go and air traffic is aware of what they're doing there, the better off I think we're going to be as a community where, okay, we're not tracking you moment by moment, but we know you're supposed to be there. And if something now transits into an area that they're not supposed to be in, it's either a blunder or something nefarious, but at least we can get to the point where we understand who's supposed to be where and start organizing the community a little better. So I think those technologies will pay off big in that regard.
Is the FAA collecting any data on what kinds of cases local law enforcement is prosecuting when it comes to unmanned aircraft?
We do know, I think, about most of them. We don't follow them that closely. Again, if someone's being prosecuted, it's likely they've also had an interaction with one of our safety inspectors who's looking at the aviation element of it. Now, the criminal prosecution may be a trespass or, for whatever local laws may have been violated, and we support that to the extent we can. And we are usually informed of how far those go and whether or not they go to trial. And you've read about the few, where there's been serious determinations by judges of jail sentences and those sorts of things. But our biggest interest is really in getting compliance. So, if we understand there's someone who's operating, our inspectors are there to try to figure out what is it you want to do and how can you go about doing it and make sure that you come into compliance.
The related question, aren't first responders the best at interdiction, and how are we working with police?
We've done a lot of outreach to the law enforcement community. We have regular working relationships with law enforcement because on a lot of aviation issues, but as long ago as probably 2 years now, we put out our initial guidance to law enforcement about what to share with us if they are involved in an event, and how we can, or how people can report to law enforcement if they see an operation that they think is in an inappropriate location or bothersome or troublesome in some way. So we do work closely with law enforcement to find out what are they seeing operating in their airspace, and also to use them when we have events that we can report and track to a particular location or an individual.
Okay, so here we have a drone enthusiast who is concerned about a neighbor that flies his drone in the neighborhood day and night. I'm concerned about safety. Who do I call?
Local law enforcement. Again, we've given them guidance both on how to respond to that local call, but make sure they also share that information with us so that we can look at what's the airspace that's being implicated, and does that have other safety ramifications? And again, assuming they're satisfied that the operator was inappropriately but by mistake operating, we can educate that individual as well.
What about the flip side? Someone who has taken the law in their own hands and they're shooting legally operating unmanned aircraft with guns or other things.
Call your local law enforcement, right? These are local law enforcement issues. It's just like if you had an animal that was annoying you or whatever it is. Local law enforcement is the right place to begin that discussion and that investigation. If it has aviation ramifications, they'll share that with us.
Okay, now we hear from a cop. I am local law enforcement.
Really? Stand up. Let me see your badge.
how do I know that an unmanned aircraft operating is doing so legally?
Well, you'd need to investigate it. So, I mean, you're not enforcing, I'm sorry, doing so?
Doing so legally.
Oh.
How do I know that they're operating legally?
Well, so I guess it's two different things. If you mean legally by FAA standards, we can answer that question for you, and there are local FAA offices, not in every community, obviously, but they can be contacted, or our UAS integration office. Law enforcement usually is not looking to see if they are complying with FAA regulations. That's our responsibility. Local law enforcement is looking to see if it is complying with local local criminal requirements. You know, again, is it trespassing? Is it has it violated privacy limitations that may be at play in that particular community? So the law enforcement piece is about enforcing the law. If after you've determined that it's legally flying for your purposes, notification to FAA would be helpful so that we can reach out to the operator.
Okay. There's a lot of questions. So if the drone operator is flying over his own yard, what law is he breaking?
So I started life as a lawyer, and the first thing you learn is never answer a hypothetical question. So, right? 'Cause who knows what the facts are? But you know, if you are concerned, call your local law enforcement and let them address it. If it's not a local law enforcement issue, they'll share it with the FAA. If it's not an FAA regulatory violation, your neighbor can fly.
And so one last question relating to the local versus the federal, and there are a lot more questions. So if I didn't get to your question, it's because there are a lot of other topics here. But to clarify, does the FAA have absolute authority over all airspace, including that over personal property, county parks, state parks, et cetera, or what are local authorities?
So the administrator and I have had this conversation before. I'm not sure we always see eye to eye
We'll argue both sides
Right.
of the issue.
Right. So certainly the traditional perspective for the FAA has been that the federal government has control of the airspace over the United States. The reality, historically, with manned operations is that there were certain naturally limiting factors to the use of that airspace, because manned aircraft need a certain amount of space in order to operate, take off, and land. So your yard, while we might well have argued we own the airspace there, we couldn't use it because your house was a natural barrier that didn't allow for manned aviation to operate into your backyard in, you know, suburbia. There are many communities where people buy houses all together, they live in that community, they build a runway, and they all fly their planes in and out of their own backyards. So it does occur. And that is airspace that the FAA is responsible for. But the realities now come into play. So yes, there's zoning limitations. There are the right for you to have a certain amount of enjoyment from your properties. You can build your properties. I mean, the FAA can't stop buildings being built around airports, even though they may interfere with how we would like to safely operate those, because there are rights to the property that you own. And that's really what I think we've asked the DAC to help us analyze, because this new community adds a new wrinkle, because your vehicles don't face that same kind of natural limitation that were posed by buildings, that was posed to manned aviation by the mere existence of buildings.
You know, and I think that an illustration of this that some of you have heard me talk about is one that happened relating to temporary helicopter operations, you know, in Park City, Utah, around the Sundance Film Festival. By our regulation, the operator of this temporary helicopter service did everything right. They got a temporary certificate to operate a heliport. They had appropriately lighted it, marked it. They had checked in with air traffic, had established routes that helicopter transiting the area would follow, and so on down the line. They did not obtain any approval from the county in which this temporary facility was located. And so helicopter service started, and well, you can sort of see this where this movie is going. The neighbors went nuts. There was a lot of concern about noise. It's an agricultural area, and so there was a lot of concern about impacts on livestock and so on down the line. And what it boiled down to was that this particular county's zoning code includes no provision for the establishment of a temporary heliport. Now, it is the operator's view that it is therefore not prohibited. It is the county's view that it is therefore not allowed. And I believe that matter is still being litigated, more than a year and a half later. And so, but I think that brings into sharp focus if you're considering effectively turning individuals' homes into what amount to a type of airport, what does this raise in terms of local zoning responsibilities for the use of the property on the ground versus what's transiting the airspace? And they're related questions, but nonetheless, it is important that you talk about both of those activities. Okay, we have there are a whole series of questions relating to the state of the federal budget, and specifically the FAA's need to accommodate a growing and important new sector in aviation at a time of tight or reduced budgets. And so the question is, can we take a little bit of time to talk about the challenge of doing that and how we're trying to find that balance? And I'll start with you, Peggy.
So it's always a challenge, just as you always have challenges with resources, whether in your business or at home. I'd like to drive a Jaguar. I don't. There are resource limits. So we are always looking at how we can balance that. Within the Aviation Safety Organization, we're doing a lot, not only with UAS, but with manned aviation as well, to make sure that we're focused on the highest risk areas, on those things that pose the most likely potential for catastrophic failure, because the industry can be responsible for a lot of that repetitive approval kinds of things that we require in manned aircraft. I think on the UAS side, because we're still at that point of enabling this technology to operate more extensively, we're going to need to find ways to provide some additional resources to UAS. And again, we may well be able to move some of the resources we've used on manned systems because we are able to delegate more and more authority to our manufacturers and to our airline operators because of the safety systems that they have in place. But it will be a challenge. And that's why the more we can figure out between us, what is it industry can do and what is it that the government must do in order for you to be able to operate, that will help all of us, I think, set our resources appropriately.
Carrie?
No, it's certainly, I think it's a concern and a challenge. I think we're meeting the demand to a large degree today, but clearly, I think this space is moving so quickly that the needs could outpace the resources that we have, and we're facing hiring freezes. So there's a lot happening in this space, and it's a continued concern for me and for my organization.
Mm-hmm. Winston?
Same here. It is a challenge. As a small organization, you have a fairly small operation budget, and you have several people wearing multiple hats. And with some of the personnel challenges, and as you saw or talked about, a lot of the research challenges that we have to integrate these new technologies and answer these important questions, it adds to those challenges. So, we'll do the best we can and use the resources we have in the most efficient way possible.
Yeah.
So where the research questions have a lot of commonality with the manned world, we certainly keep doing all of that. I think one of the things that we're actually, what I'm looking at is whether or not the use of drones or UAS in our operation in the test and evaluation and exploration phase wouldn't make some of our other costs, less burdensome. If there's a way to try to use a UAS instead of a manned aircraft in order to do operations to prove out technologies and techniques that we need for both manned aircraft and for unmanned aircraft, we're trying to figure out how to exploit the technology in that regard and maybe lessen our costs on the total front. But it continues to be a challenge to figure out how to balance all of these budgets.
Okay, so the last question, and we'll just go down the line and ask everybody, As we are, this is our second annual symposium for unmanned aircraft. And we've talked a lot about what has been accomplished since our first symposium. So when we're together again as an industry a year from now, what would you like to see in terms of what has been accomplished over the last year? And Jim, I'll start with you.
So I think as we start rolling out automation, and I know we're trying to get the prototype land system in place by the end of this calendar year. NASA's moving very quickly with the UTM right behind it, so we're hoping that maybe this time next year we'll have a lot more experience with the actual systems that we're talking about. And those, being able to see that we can move forward together should be able to get the community to take a look at the technologies, start getting more organized around how to file to fly into a particular airspace and inform others. I feel like there should be a momentum that's built around those kinds of technologies as we go forward.
Winston?
You know, better integration of the technology on the airports. I think these drones can provide so much to enhance safety and operations on an actual airport, whether it's safety and security, even FOD inspections, wildlife management. So I'd like to see the ability to integrate them on an airport environment. And also to really have a better understanding between the local jurisdictions, whether it's the municipalities, the cities, the police, and all the county and officials and the zoning communities on how that relationship works and how they can work together.
Terry?
I would agree with what Jim said. I would also like to see and hope that we start to see more clarity around what information needs to be depicted on the controller's displays. So the sooner we can do that, we can start getting more clarity around the budgets we're going to need to make those changes into the existing automation. I'd also hope that we have more clarity in the security world, you know, for airports themselves, and then the role of certainly FAA in that, because there's a lot of federal equities in that trade space. So I think we need to get moving in that regard.
Peggy?
Yeah, I think the second point you just made there around this issue of security and protecting infrastructure, as we saw in the last congressional language, I think we'll have real clarity around that and better understand how we're going to be able to do that. Unfortunately, we won't have new rulemaking in place. It's just not enough time between now and this time next year. But I would expect that we've really refined the process for exemptions and waivers so that we can enable whatever is allowable already within the regulatory framework to move much more smoothly, take advantage of some of the automated tools that may be available by then. So we're doing the best we can within the framework that we have now and really pushing to that next level of rulemaking so that we can broaden to operations over people beyond visual line of sight and some of the things that right now are hampered because we have to do waivers and exceptions.
To be clear, when you say rulemaking done, you mean final rule?
Final rule, right.
Final.